I'm Thomas Smith. I'm a technology journalist and the CEO of Gatto Images, and I also have worked in AI for over a decade. And this is Tom Talks Tech, a new podcast where I'll share perspectives on everything in technology and the technology world, from cooking to crypto. Join me here as I explore the world of technology on Tom Talks Tech. I'm Tom. I'm back in my car again today talking about tech. Today I want to talk a little bit about a piece that I just published this morning in Debugger on Medium. And you can go to debugger.medium.com. You can follow me on Medium. And I kind of pitched it originally as a long, strange, personal kind of celebration / rant / condemnation of Silicon Valley. And that's a good way to describe it. It's a little bit difficult to kind of figure out exactly what the piece was and how to describe it, and struggled with coming up with a title for it. At the moment, it's titled I'll Never Leave Silicon Valley, which is true. And it really grew actually out of a quote by Gertrude Stein that didn't originally apply to Silicon Valley, because obviously that was after her time. The quote was that there's no there there. And she originally said it about Oakland, California, which is, if you ask the Census Bureau, part of Silicon Valley, I don't think anyone would say it actually is, but it's very nearby. And the concept is that there's kind of no place to Silicon Valley. It's you can drive through it, as I said in the piece, for hours and not even know that you've passed through it. Yet at the same time, it's this incredibly innovative region, probably the most impact on American GDP of any region in the country, certainly, and it's one of the most productive regions. It's measured by GDP anywhere in the world. It's only beaten by one tiny piece of Qatar that has a lot of oil exploration. Other than that, it's basically, effectively the most productive region in the world. It also has the most expensive housing and the highest paid workers. There's just a lot of superlatives that apply to the valley. And I'm a photographer. I moved out to California in 2013, partially to be closer to the tech scene. And I share in the piece a little bit of that personal experience and journey of coming to Silicon Valley in 2013. My wife and I started out going to PyCon, the Python conference in Santa Clara, and presenting there, and just returning over and over again, and describe just kind of knowing based on a lot of small things and a lot of feelings, but also just things like getting off the flight at San Francisco International and seeing these business-to-business ads in the airport for these super specific tech products, enterprise routers and server cooling systems, and things where they were probably targeting 5 people who they thought would probably get off of the flight at some point. And I realized, if this was an environment where that kind of thing was profitable and made sense to do, then this was home. This is where we fit. And so we came out to 2013, and the Valley is really different now even than it was at the time. When we first came out, it was right after Facebook had done their IPO. It was right before Twitter had done theirs. So it was really this transition point, I think, in Valley life, where the old sort of what had happened basically between the dot-com bubble in the late 90s and right around 2010, you'd seen this kind of resurgence of the startup culture, bootstrapped startups, and then ultimately the VC money came back. So you had these growing social media companies. We saw YouTube and Instagram and ultimately Uber, and all of these companies kind of grow out of the Valley relatively quickly and then be kind of snapped up by the Googles and Facebooks of the world. So it's the second wave, I would say, of internet companies kind of growing. The first wave being the Googles and Facebooks of the world, and the second was those companies like Instagram and YouTube that became part of the big ones. The third wave now is Snapchat and those kind of companies. But we came in right at that transition point. And so life in the Valley was changing pretty dramatically. You didn't have this sort of ethos of the bootstrapped startup eat ramen noodles all night, code, there was too much money, I think, at that point already for that life to really still exist in a lot of ways. It was too expensive to live in the Valley. And you had all these engineers that had been early to companies like Twitter and Facebook and had been there for years, and suddenly their companies were public, and these stock options that they've been sitting on were worth, in many cases, millions or tens of millions of dollars. So you had all these kind of newly rich engineers purchasing properties and driving up the rent prices all over the Bay Area. And Silicon Valley, I think, was just becoming a lot more serious in a lot of ways. It's always been a serious place in some ways, but this particular wave was kind of cresting at that point. And our rent went up. We didn't end up in the Valley. We've always been just outside of it. But the rent, even in Walnut Creek, where we were, went up 22% in the first year that we were there after Twitter's IPO. So it's a pretty substantial change, and even there, and in the Valley, it was even more intense. And I think the culture in the Valley shifted pretty dramatically at that point as well, from, that sort of almost happy-go-lucky, unironic, change the world, do no evil type of thing, was shifting to what we see today, which is really a recognition that tech is the mediator of world culture and of a lot of the economy, and that these really thorny issues of influence, of misinformation, of diversity, those are really substantial and things that tech has to reckon with. But that kind of wasn't happening yet, even though there was all this money pouring into the tech world. So it was a really interesting moment of transition, and I write about that in the piece, and what that transition was like in the Valley. But I think in a lot of ways it's always been an area of a lot of intense contrasts and movement and changes. So one of the things I talk about is that, the Valley has always been like this, going all the way back to the 1950s, when you had Fairchild Semiconductor, which was the company that put the silicon in Silicon Valley, into the 60s, kind of creating this culture of high tech, and also these kind of weird military industrial ties that have always existed to some degree in the Valley, with defense contractors, and originally they were developing missile guidance systems, and that was the reason to have silicon chips. And then that morphed into the space race, so you had nuclear missiles being built, but also the same systems being used to send people to the moon. And then the offshoots of that, and the companies that grew out of Fairchild, then kind of developed into the early stage companies that were in the Valley. And then over years, those have just morphed and grown and spun off other pieces and been reinvented into the companies of the 80s and 90s with Apple, and finally into Google, Facebook, and ultimately Uber and Snapchat. Although it's not a Valley company necessarily, but all of the sort of third wave companies of today. And that's a story that I think is represented really beautifully from a graphical perspective at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, which is right on the edge of Google's campus in Mountain View. And they have a tree that fills a whole wall, and it starts with Fairchild as the trunk, and then as it branches and expands upwards, you see each of the sort of wave of companies growing out of each other, and being old companies being reinvented and taken apart, sometimes preserved. Intel's been there forever, for example, but a lot of companies just rolling into others, and people would kind of come and solve the interesting challenges and then move on to the next thing, or they'd exit with a ton of capital and start a venture capital firm. So you have, Fairchild leads into Kleiner Perkins, leads into Google, which leads into Uber, and that tree kind of grows from the floor to the ceiling in that process. So that reinvention, that switching, that mixing up that's always existed in the Valley, I think is still there, and was still there at that change, that moment of transition, and is still there to a large extent today. I talk a little bit about the geography of the Valley, the debated geography. I think there's certain towns like Mountain View and Palo Alto that everybody would agree that are part of the Valley and the core of the Valley, but then there's other parts that try to become that. I mean, San Jose, for example, really wants to be the Valley's big city, and in a lot of ways, economically, it is. You've got international airport, you've got the headquarters of companies like Adobe and now Zoom in San Jose, but at the same time, I think culturally, it's just never managed that shift. And really, the center of the Valley is still Mountain View, Palo Alto, Menlo Park, driven a lot by Stanford, that I share in the piece, feeds a lot of talent into the valley, driven by Sand Hill Road, where most of the valley's money comes from, most of the nation's venture capital comes from. So you have these sort of interesting geographies. And I think Sand Hill Road is a great example of that. You can go to literally one intersection on Sand Hill Road, and you can turn around or walk around briefly and see Sequoia, Kleiner Perkins, Silicon Valley Bank, Andreessen Horowitz, basically all of the money that's flowing into the valley from the VC world until these companies go public. It's concentrated in this tiny, tiny chunk of office space, very compact, beautifully landscaped, right there on Sand Hill Road. You can basically walk around. If you have a good company, you could probably raise $100 million with, not getting 10,000 steps on your Fitbit walking around that chunk. So there's these interesting geographies, and there's towns like Mountain View, for example, where there's a very strong suburban element to it, but then you have Google's campus there that just keeps growing and taking things over and snapping up buildings. So it's sort of this original Googleplex that captured the company's spirit and concept, and then it's just gobbled up, these random buildings that just sprout Google signs and become part of Google's headquarters. Now they're building another kind of designed campus to add on to that, but it's just this sprawl that kind of starts to take over whole towns as these companies grow. Same deal with Facebook. Menlo Park is basically mostly Facebook's headquarters, and they continue to add chunks and pieces and to expand there. So I think the geography of the valley is really fascinating. And, I describe, again, being a photographer, living near the valley, and kind of wondering one point in time, what would it be like, or what would it have been like to photograph a really substantial cultural moment? What was it like to be at Woodstock, or to, photograph a young Bob Dylan or something like that? And I realized all of a sudden, I remember kind of a moment of clarity there, that I was in the middle, or we were in the middle of a cultural moment. This is the cultural moment, I think, of our generation. The growth of tech, the emergence of tech as this powerful force in the world, and here we were right on the edge of the valley. And so I started to document that and photograph that. And I started a series called Visualizing the Valley that I've been working on for over 4 years now. And it's just an attempt to capture photographically every aspect of the valley's geography and its companies, its economic life, its cultural life, its restaurants, everything that sort of feeds into what Silicon Valley is. And it's been something I've worked on again for years, and I expect I'm going to work on that forever. I don't think I'll ever stop developing that series. But in the time that I've been there documenting, it's changed dramatically. And again, I think you've seen this renewed recognition that tech is powerful and destructive in many cases. And so, where you saw 5 years ago at Facebook, they were printing these letterpress posters, really beautiful posters that said "Move fast and break things." Now they say "Black Lives Matter," and they say nothing that happens at Facebook is somebody else's problem. So there's a recognition, in many cases, I think, driven by the Valley's own employees, that Valley culture, Valley life, and the work that they do is significant, and in many cases it's been very destructive. Technologies like facial recognition that come out of these companies have the power to cause a lot of damage, and so I think there's a reckoning happening within the Valley and outside of it, with antitrust, interest in antitrust suits, condemnation of the Valley in a lot of places, a recognition of a lack of diversity. But at the same time, I think this is still this incredibly innovative place, and a place that drives a lot of positive change and certainly a lot of economic impact for the world, and a lot of technologies that I think are ultimately a huge benefit to society. So it's, again, these very, very strong contradictions. And one thing I delve into a little bit is, I think during COVID, especially when there's this pivot towards remote work, there's a lot of people saying, well, the Valley's dead. People are going to move everything to Austin, Texas. There's no reason to be in the Valley anymore. And I don't believe that at all. I think the Valley is not really a place. If you've never been there, never spent time there, you think of it as this place or this business story, and it's not. It's really more than that, I think. The term ecosystem gets used way too much, but it's a pretty good term for the valley. It's this mixture of culture, of institutions, of laws that are very favorable, about immigration in many cases, about non-competes. It's a history, it's a legacy, it is a physical place, it's money, and a particular culture around how to allocate capital. There's too many things that are part of that for it to just up and move. So I think we'll see colonies, I think we'll see movements to other places, we'll see more remote work, more people within the valley working from home, but I think the valley is strong, and that tree that started with Fairchild will continue to grow. Sometimes for worse, sometimes for better. As I say in the piece, sometimes the valley disgusts me, but I still love it. I wouldn't even say I still love it. I love it, and it's a place that I plan to call home forever. So check it out. It's at debugger.medium.com. Let me know your thoughts. You can follow me on Twitter at TomSmith585. And if you're not subscribing already, please subscribe here to my podcast.